Okay, Elma. Hello, everybody.
Good evening, everyone. So excited for tonight. I have so many questions about this book.
So
Yeah.
I suppose hello, everyone from Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Welcome to another book event with the Cheeky Natives. I think Elma and I should have like a theme song just to start us up, right? But as you know,
Honestly.
the Cheeky Natives are your favorite bays of literature and Black literature in particularly. We aim to have conversations that we believe authors will not have at any other platform, in depth, insightful, engaging conversations. And today we have the wonderful privilege of being in conversation with Tshidiso Moletsane. And we're going to, obviously, as you can see right in front of you on the screen, we have, if you buy now the book, I will share a link in a little bit. If you buy the book from Loot, you'll get a 30% discount. And what we want to do is, buy it right now, get the 30% discount, and post pictures and tag Penguin and tag Cheeky Natives and Umuzi as a way to show that you're supporting Black writers. And so I'm going to remove this off the screen for a bit so that you can see our beautiful faces and we can have a lovely conversation. Okay, so today we're going to have a conversation about this book, Junx. I'm going to read the author's bio, just so that you know who we're talking about. And as I was saying, I thought the bio was like really interesting. So I hope you found it interesting too. So the bio read, Tshidiso Moletsane submitted a sample of this manuscript to his publisher in 2016. At the time, he had most of the notes to complete his book on his phone, but then he was hijacked and shot. Don't worry, he's fine. But as you can see, he's on the screen with us. His phone was in the car and he had to start over. He did. He lives in Gauteng, splitting his time between Soweto and Valgevieren Park. Junx is his first novel. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives, Tshidiso.
Hi. Hello. Afutuba Mtlakasi. I was just paying attention to that just now. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. This is so cool.
We're so excited to have you. I mean, firstly, I have so many questions about this book, right? There are so many things that Tochanol and I spoke about, and I think some of the things that came up will really resonate with a lot of people, right? So, I mean, the first thing for me is to ask about what it feels to be trailblazing, right? This is the first of the imprint from Umuzi, and in many ways, you are a trailblazer, right? So you break new ground in terms of content, style, and form. And you have the distinction of being the very first trailblazer. And there's just something about being the first. I guess that's why we also have a nationwide obsession with being first everything. So I want to talk about what being an Umuzi trailblazer has meant for you and your work, and the kind of style of writing that you did in Junx.
Okay. Now, not to be pedantic, right? But essentially the name is Junx, right? So it's Junx. Yeah. So it's actually named after like a friend of mine. So it's like my friend's nickname. So the name of the book is Junx. The guy on the cover is also a friend of mine. His name is Lene. He's also a friend of mine. The guy who wrote the foreword is also a friend of mine. Yeah, Puke is also a friend of mine. So it was like very collaborative. I tried to make it collaborative. Yeah. And okay, so the Trailblazer. I wasn't really like, because okay, I believe the book would have been published in 2020, I believe, had it not been for COVID. So I think it probably wouldn't have been. I'm not sure. I didn't really ask, but because it was pushed like a year ahead, then I became one of the first. I became the first trailblazer. So I remember asking, what does that mean, really? Then they were like, no, it's like a cool sort of like niche concept they want to create for like local writers. And I think I'm very glad to have the distinction of being the first one, because even my book has like the number one behind it, which is pretty. I like that. It's kind of nice. I enjoy the privilege of being the first trailblazer for Umuzi.
I guess also then to just expand a little bit on that, there's some themes in the book that I think are really important, and I there's something that really stuck out for me, and that was around emotional neglect, right? So often I think when we think of raising children in Black communities, we think of like keeping them alive, clothing them, taking them to school. But there's a chapter in your book where the protagonist speaks about how he didn't feel that his parents were bad people, but he felt that he was emotionally neglected and he was often left to his own devices. And there is something that means for him in that context. And I wanted to speak a little bit about why that was such a central theme in writing his story.
Okay, so like I said before we started, right? So like some of it is autobiographical. So like some of that is kind of like autobiographical. Not that I wasn't particularly neglected, right? But like I was most of the time left to my own devices, and I saw that I was. The thing is, I could have been exploited in certain ways had I not been like had I not been like smarter, sort of. So I saw that there's yeah.
So it's interesting because I think what you know, I often see this in my own unlearning and like my own healing, right? Like we're so afraid to say the things that we want to say, right? So it's interesting when you say I wasn't per se neglected, right? Because in many instances, we come in defense of these people that raised us and say, like, please, like, they did the best that they could. But sometimes naming things is very political, right? And sometimes saying, I was neglected, and as a result of neglection, these are the things that could potentially happen to me if I wasn't wiser. I think we need to begin to own the things that were done to us in order to have fuller and more meaningful conversation, as opposed to hiding behind. Because I know what I do for myself, right? Is that I often say, oh, my parents did the best that they could, but I don't know. Like they may have done the best that they could, but what they did in my eyes right now with the information that I have was incorrect, right? That we were being neglected for whatever reason that they may have been. So I thought it was just interesting to think about, like, even the way we're articulating like things that have happened to us, we still have that sort of protective mechanism that we employ.
Yeah, so that's an incredible point, right? But to what I was saying earlier is that, like, I think I also say this in the book, like they didn't know any better, really. Because I think said the same thing just now. Like, we raising kids as Black people, we didn't really see it as like this this toil. It's like really like this essential like investment as far as emotion and time, right? So with me, so I was an only child, right? No, I wasn't actually. I was like the firstborn for like, then my baby sister's 7 years younger than me. So I was like doted upon for like for most of my childhood. Then when I became like a teenager, I think that's when I was sort of just left alone. And that's really around the time where like you could potentially find yourself in some very like difficult situations, especially when you get to that age, when you start to really like start drinking, start going out, start doing all these things. So then again in the book you see this a lot, because like he doesn't really talk much about like his family, his whatever. He talks about his mom a couple times, then he mentions his grandmother, but generally the idea that he's been by himself except with like his imaginary friend, but generally it's just been him, le are.
And it's interesting to think about like what happens to us when we're left to our own devices, so to say, right? When there's no guidance. We often speak about like child-headed households and how like as children we had to raise like people, right? But you see the protagonists in this book really having to fend for themselves. They do these flashback and think about their own parents and like sort of what happened in their parents' lives, right? But in truth, they have to fend for themselves, right? But the interesting question that I've been thinking about upon reflecting about the book is like, how do you begin to look after yourself when like you don't even know what that looks like as a child, right? And as a young adult, how do you begin to know what are things that are good for you and what are things that are bad for you and what are things that are going to move you forward when you've never had that, right? Because I think for many of us, we may be privileged because we've gone to former ex-model C schools or private schools and stuff like that. And even though we may have been neglected, there were some people who were our guardians in those places. But let's say you grew up in a place where you didn't go to an ex-model C school, right? You didn't have people who were able to take you under their wing. It sort of feels like that is also what the protagonist is trying to say to us, like that you kind of have to find and figure out the way for yourselves. Like the people in the community are not necessarily trustworthy. Your friends are not necessarily trustworthy. You are kind of the only person, I remember Biko said, "Black man, you are on your own." And in the true sense of the word, it feels like that. It feels like you are left to fend for yourself. And I wanted to know, what was the type of commentary that you're trying to bring out with the protagonist, sort of navigating this this idea of having to find out for themselves how fashioning a life for themselves looks like?
Okay, difficult question. That the second one already, it's a really tough question. So, okay, again, talking from again, 30% of the book is sort of like autobiographical. So, like I said, when you get to a certain age, you are at a point where you're like ripe for like exploitation. If you don't really like, if you're not really wary of these things. So as you go along and you see certain things happen to other people, you then start to figure out, okay, this thing is, I could that could have been me. That could have been me. Had I not made better decisions, this could have happened to me. That could have happened to me. So you become more, I don't know, like vigilant. You become more like very, very wary, very guarded as far as what you do and who you associate with. Because again, with me, I've had people in my family who've been like arrested, who've done a lot of crazy, like drug addicts, you know what I mean, alcoholics, and then you see that and you try and learn from that. Even though nobody is impressing it upon you, no one is telling you ABC. You just have to like figure it out on your own, and then you try to, as best as you can, like fulfill yourself, but then also not go don't do too much, because that's dangerous.
I think speaking to that, right, and speaking to danger, we see the protagonist in this book lives a life of precarity, right? His life is just always on the edge. But I also think of that as a metaphor for Black life, right? Like the precariousness of Black life, where really our lives are always on the edge. And maybe that's why we don't need to thrill seek and bungee jump and seek adrenaline, because Black life is precarious, right? Black life is on the edge. And I think so much about how living a life of precarity also shapes the narrative of the protagonist, also shapes the ways in which he navigates his life. Like, if he had believed that he held inherent worth, but also that his life was thought to be worthy, right? Would he have made different decisions? Would he have moved differently? Would he have been given access to mental health resources that were not available to him, right? Because you get a sense of like there's a helplessness in the ways in which people even interact with him. So people will be like, dude, stop this thing, why are you doing this thing? But there's almost just like this helplessness and this precarity in the way that he lives his life that shapes the kind of decisions that he makes. And I'm so interested in the backstory of that, why your character moves in the way that he does, but also that movement as a metaphor for the ways in which so many other Black people who look like him, who inhabit those spaces, also move and make the kind of decisions that they do.
Okay, so you made a very interesting point right now about the thrill-seeking thing. That's a point you see a lot online. That like generally Black people don't go surfing, they don't go hiking because there's no absence of adrenaline in their lives, so they don't have to like chase adrenaline by doing like skydiving or whatever the point. Okay, so in the forward, Koketo says Black life is a juxtaposition, right? So we are living on the margins. We are living on the margins generally, and we are trying to find our ways outside of the margins. And then even now, there's a lot of like hate directed towards like the Black middle class, right? The people who have like the resources to do the mental health, to do whatever, everything that you mentioned just now, all the resources that are not accessible to like other people. So then how do the other people then manage? It's from my experience, it's just like mostly like it's just like alcoholism, drug addiction. There's an emptiness that people want to fill. So, and because they can't really find other ways to like, they don't really recognize even that they're going through like some serious like mental issues, that they have like some very like horrific demons. They don't really know how to really deal with these things, and hence they fall into the cycle of like drug addiction, of like promiscuity, of alcoholism, just anything just to numb themselves.
It's interesting you speak about that, because I think one of the major themes in your book is this idea of substance use and misuse and abuse. But I use those words deliberately because Alma and I were having a conversation about like how we must begin to start thinking about phrasing these particular things. When we talk about substance abuse, we don't necessarily think about the underlying consequences or the underlying determinants that lead people to substance use, right? And I think that effectively is one major theme that comes from the book. The idea that like connected with mental health is that, if mental health was accessible in this country, like many of us may not use substances in order to cope, right, in the way that we are doing. And I think particularly the conversation about substance abuse is interesting, thinking about what was happening during lockdown, where we had periods of alcohol not being served. And we saw, like, when alcohol started being served, how people were jubilant and essentially elated to be able to have some form of alcohol, right? And you think about like this sort of dependency, right? And how we must start thinking about alcohol abuse as a sort of chronic condition that needs to be treated, and not as this pariah that, ole, yo, kilitahwa type of thing. But right, really to go to the underhand, why is Tshidiso drinking as much as they're drinking? What is going on? Let's find out what the root cause of the drinking is so we can address that problem. Because I think if we just think it's drinking for drinking's sake, we don't really look at like the interplay between mental health and substance use in this country. And I wanted to know what your reflections are and what you were trying to effectively do when you were writing, because a large majority of the book is this idea of the protagonist just like, I think the protagonist is drunk and high all of the book, right? There are very lucid moments, but like throughout the book, the protagonist is just wah. So I wanted to speak about those reflections.
Okay, so I started writing the book when I was like 19 or 20, right? Then at the time I was in Wits University and I was going through like a very, very deep depression. And then that's around the time I started like really, really drinking. So I saw for myself that, okay, I realized that, okay, I'm drinking because I have this thing that's going on in my mind that I'm trying to get rid of, right? So I became like very, very suicidal. Then it wasn't until I went to like a psychiatrist when I was like 21, I got like antidepressants, and I sort of like started to slow down, and I started to realize, okay, this is why I was drinking, this is why I was like being like very, what's the word, impulsive. I was doing a lot of like crazy things, and I realized, okay, this is just because I'm dealing with something that I'm trying to get rid of. And because at that time, because I finally did get help, I got drugs, I got like, I want to say counseling kind of, because I was able to get these things. I was able to see, oh, this is the problem. And then that's how I went from that to writing this book about this guy who's trying not to face whatever he's dealing with, even though he knows better, even though he is given like because I say it in the book that he just stopped taking antidepressants because he just doesn't like how it made him feel. Because the same thing happened to me. I stopped for like 3 months. Then after that, I was bad. Then I'd start again. Then there was like a whole thing, and I became morose and I became sad. It's like your relationship with antidepressants is it's strange. So because I had to.
So I wanted to say, I think it's also informed with the stigma around mental health, right? So you kind of develop this really bad relationship with wellness, right? And about like, actually, sometimes these things make me feel or make me cope and live better. And maybe they make me feel a particular way and I don't like this particular feeling. So I'm going to go off them because I think I have some form of control when I'm off them. But I think it also has to do with like just the stigma around mental health, right? Around how, like, they say, black people, depression. So there's also a way in which we engage with it. Because when you think about the protagonist in this book, like quotes like writers from America, like the protagonist in the book, right? And like they should know better, but even in knowing better, they make these decisions. And I think it's a result of like the stigma we've attached to mental health.
Yeah, for the point regarding stigma, I myself, like my depression, I kept my depression like a secret for years. Like I didn't even tell anybody until maybe like 3-4 years later. Then I started to be like, now I've been depressed for a long time. I don't even know how it came about, how I ended up opening up to people about it. But yes, there is a stigma to it. I remember I wouldn't even tell my parents when I got home. I was like, no, I want to go see a psychiatrist. What did she say? Oh no, we just talked. And then she just gave me some pills. But what's wrong? It's nothing. Because for some reason I didn't want to like face it that, oh, I'm losing my mind kind of. Well, what I thought I was at the time. I think I'm losing my mind because of the stigma attached to it. I couldn't reconcile it really with myself, with my parents, because I didn't understand what it was at the time, because I was still kind of young and I didn't really know what was going on.
I actually think that tied to this, right, is the ways in which depression, right, can rob you of so many life experiences. So I want to juxtapose the experience that the protagonist has with his two friends who are at university. And he actually has a moment in the book where he speaks about, you know, he, as a child, he always wanted to go to Wits University. So he's got these two friends who have gone to Wits and who seem to be getting it together, right? And there's this moment of realization for him, like, this is something that I wanted to do as a child that I've now lost and missed out on. And so much of that is also related to his mental health. And I thought that that was such a poignant moment in the book and captured so much of the experience of what struggles with our mental health can rob us of. And I want us to talk a little bit to that experience, right? Because I think often there is the feeling of the regret, but there's not the feeling of the acknowledgement of the kind of toll that mental health issues can take on your dreams and your ability to realize them.
I feel like that's really only starting to get like airplay right now. I feel like now people are starting to be more aware and more cognizant of like, because even like if we've all been to university, I assume. Like we all know people who like struck. I was one of them. Like we all know people who like who couldn't. You could tell that this guy's not. He's not here. You know, like the common thing they say, "Kokasi." Like when you're too smart, he was just studying too hard, and now he lost his mind. But most likely, it was just like a lot of like the mental toil that like the tertiary and like the expectations that are placed upon you. So the weight it carries, it's very difficult for most people to manage, and then a lot of people just crumble. A lot of people. I didn't finish. I went to Veds. I was there for 2 years. I dropped out because I was a mess. I was a mess by the time I started going to, like I had already decided I was going to commit suicide and whatever. By the time I started going to psychiatry, I was really like out of it. I was like gone. So you see now people are starting to be more aware of it. Now people are starting to be more like sympathetic to the plight of just people kokasi or just the average like students, whoever's going through whatever they're going through. You can see, especially when you've been there, you can see that, oh no, this guy's is dealing with this particular thing. Then I try myself. Yeah.
I think also it's interesting to think about like suicide ideation, right? So oftentimes there's also a stigma around like people who die by suicide, and the idea that like, oh, these people wanted to just kill themselves. But I've been thinking a lot about like, I know when I have moments of like intense anxiety and like just overthinking and overanalyzing, I kind of want that feeling to stop, right? And I don't think I want to die. I don't think that that is what I want to do, but you want these feelings to stop. And I think people who are feeling like very sad and all that, sometimes they want the feeling to stop. And in our minds and in the mind, sometimes it's like the only way I can make this stop is through these means, right? And so I think we need to have a more nuanced conversation and a more open conversation about like depression and anxiety and mental health issues, and how sometimes you really want to live, you want to make the decision that you want to be alive, right? But you're just like, I want this other thing to go. This thing, like Alma spoke about this earlier, about like how these things rob you of like living a full life, right? And also it comes back to accessibility to mental health care, right? If you are also Soweto and you're going to study at Wits University, which is considered to be this prestigious university, and you may be first generation from your thing, like the thought of you messing up, like weighs so heavily on you because your parents are depending on you, your neighbors are depending on you, your friends are depending on you, the other people in the community are depending on you. So that weight is a lot, right? And you feel like you are not able to make sense of what is happening because of that weight. And I think we need to really begin to have very honest discussions about like accessibility to mental health care. Because I think when you have accessibility to mental health care, we may see things to shift a little bit. But mental health care is so expensive in this country that like people are going to, again, reverting back to substance abuse, people sometimes just are going to take the substance use to numb the pain, even if it's temporarily. Because I think that Ari says that to the protagonist in the book, Ari, you know that's not going to do anything. Like it's temporary, but the pain is still going to be there, right? And so sometimes people want that temporary relief.
Okay, yeah. So on suicide, right? Okay, so the generally, I feel like generally people are becoming again more empathetic towards suicide. I believe you guys said Tinji were here before. Tinji who wrote that we are all from the same Gomorrah, right? So we were in like a podcasting, her and I, like a week ago, and she was talking about her dad. And then she was saying that since she was a child, her dad has been like, "Oh man, I can't wait to die. Oh man, I can't wait to die." And then when she became an adult, now she's like sympathizes with him now. She like sees that, oh, this man is like hurting. He doesn't want to die. He just has this thing that he wants to get rid of, and he doesn't know how to get rid of this thing. So now she says it's turned into like a joke between her and her father, his suicidal ideation. So I feel like now people, okay, the circles that I am in generally, people, if someone kills themselves now, it's thought of as being like super as like a sad thing. It's not like a weak thing anymore. It's not like Anna, he's weak and he just took his life. It's seen as just being like incredibly sad. And I'm glad that people are starting to like look at it that way. Because as like someone who struggled with depression, I'm very happy that I didn't go the other side. I'm very happy that I managed to get it together.
Unmuted. So I want to talk about a few things. I don't know if you can hear me. So for me, I'm really interested in the friendships in this book, right? So there is a context of changing friendships, and we see the realities change. And I'm thinking of Insecure, right? So if you're an Insecure fan, you'll see how Issa and Molly. So Molly is like the high achieving lawyer friend. Molly is the friend who wears Cartier and she just has it together. Issa is the friend who, even in her early 30s, just has no sense of what she's doing. And you see how the dynamic in their friendship shifts as their lifestyles begin to become different, right? And as their lives take different trajectories. And I think of the book as well, and how you see a shift in the trajectories of the friendships that exist, right? So you see how he's chilled with his friends, but now his friends have moved, they're at Wits, they're doing things with their lives, and there's a shift in the friendship, and there's almost a shift in the way that they navigate that friendship. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I am interested in the friendships between Black men, and also, I guess, how masculinities and ideas of masculinities make space or inhibit the growth that exists in these friendships, right? So what does it mean to be a friend with mental illness who's a male friend and not have the space for tenderness and vulnerability because of our ideas of masculinity?
I'm very fortunate in that me and my friends have a very we're a very affectionate bunch. So I never got to struggle with the ideas of like being inhibited around my friends. So like we're very open about our feelings. We're very open about just basically most things. Like we tell each other we love each other, we kiss each other all the time. People think it's weird, but we're okay with it. So I've realized that I'm like part of the minority in that sense. Because generally you're not really allowed, as a guy especially, you're not really allowed the space to really express yourself. You're not really allowed to be vulnerable, especially around your friends and even in your family. Everything's supposed to be everything just like carry that load. So I think for speaking on like the relationship, the friendships in the book, I thought you were making a different point actually when you're talking about the shift of friendships. Because when you see the friends he hangs out with Kokasi, and you see the friends that like he grew up with, essentially they're on like different sides of the thing, and then he's sort of like in the middle, right? And then essentially what happened with him? Why didn't he progress the way that his voice may have progressed?
Except that, sorry to cut you there, except that it becomes really marked in his friendships with the friends who are adverts, right? So in his friendships with the guys, that friendship is very superficial in many ways. Without giving away too much of the book, he leaves the one guy in quite a precarious situation, and he's just like, hey, it is what it is, it does what it does. Peace out, right? That friendship in many ways feels comfortable because there's a level of superficiality. But with his friends who are adverts, those are his childhood friends. He's grown up with them. They're on very much the same trajectory, and his life has taken a different turn. And that navigation is very interesting to me because I wonder, of course, we will never know because of how the book ends, what it would look like in 10 years, what that particular friendship would look like. I think there's a comfort in being around people who are moving in the same ways as you, but there's very large contrast between him and those two friends. And that for me is quite interesting.
And okay, so I don't really, if the thing had, okay, obviously the idea to me was for them had the story continued, it was for him and his friends would have been, I don't think had decided to continue, I don't think he would have ended up still being friends with the guys that sort of like moved, right, sort of elevated in life. I don't really see that he would have been part of that, because you see that Mokasi, essentially when somebody gets a certain place, people just drift apart, man. So I don't really see it as something. I feel like he would have just stuck. He would have just stayed Kokasi. This guy. I don't really see him as someone who, because he has like zero ambition. He doesn't really care for anything at all. Doesn't really want to do anything with his life. And he's comfortable with the people who the people who have ambition, people who want like well for him, like they bamutena. He's like you putting he doesn't like it. He doesn't like that people want him to do well.
We're just losing the Tlokonolo a little bit. That's fine. I wanted to speak about Ari. That's another friendship, right? I mean, it's interesting because is Ari a manifestation of his mental illness? Is Ari a coping mechanism because of this mental illness? Or is Ari really like, something else, something a little bit more metaphorical? You think of like just African ideas of spirituality and being able to see things that other people don't see, and not necessarily being judged for that, right? There are cultural understandings for being able to see things that other people can't see.
I thought about it as both. Okay, have either of you ever seen Death Note? Either of you've seen Death Note? Yeah, so I saw him as like Ryuk from Death Note. So I saw him as like a figment of his imagination, but at the same time he can affect the physical world. So I saw him as like a ghost almost like a ghost sort of thing. That's how I imagined him.
But I suppose also then the question is, what is because Ari is also someone who knows about the future, right? And obviously can't share the future, or who knows things are going to happen. So it's also interesting to think about like the usefulness of Ari in his life, right? Like he kind of could have asked, like, am I going to make it? Am I going to, is it going to get better from here? But those aren't the questions that he kind of asks Ari about, right? The questions that he asks Ari about is about, again, thinking about ideation, is about like, how am I going to die, right? Do you know how I'm going to die? Like those type of things. So I was interested to know about like the usefulness of Ari in propelling the story forward.
So Ari to me is just he is, again, I modeled him after Ryuk from Death Note, right? Ari is just a spectator. Like Ari just wants to be entertained. So he'll give the protagonist whatever information he gives him, as long as that will entertain Ari at whatever point in the story. He just wants to have fun. I think I said it somewhere because back to your point about superficial friendships. Like Ari didn't really care about this guy. He didn't really particularly care about this guy. He just enjoyed his company, but he doesn't really care about him. The same way Ryuk, I'm sorry for saying this again, the same way Ryuk didn't really care about like Light. He was just like there just to watch.
I also wanted to speak about like I want to speak about the relation of the male characters in the book towards the women in the book. I think there's quite a commentary to be made about like misogyny, like how in the book it seems that like the utility of women in this book is for men's appeasement, right? And like you see the protagonist sort of like perpetually having these encounters with these different types of women, but for his own amusement. So it isn't a respect or reverence type of thing. It's like, what can I say and what can I do in order to get a foot in to get what I want? And I wanted to know what type of commentary you're saying about that, because you see this, the protagonist does this with a number of women in the book. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? The commentary that you were saying about like just straight men's relationship to Black women in particular.
That's 100% correct. So like I intentionally wanted him to be like very, very misogynistic. I wanted him to be like, and very like clearly, it wasn't even like subtle, because there's a point where I say in the book, you can buy a girl Doritos and she'll have sex with you. You can do anything. Like it doesn't take much to sleep with a girl. You can just press these buttons and you get what you want. So he definitely he objectifies women at like the extreme end. Like the extreme end of objectification. I don't believe he even has like any female friends in the book. All of the women in his life to him are just something to conquer. It's just like a thing for him to just get through. And that's something that you see a lot Kokasi. It's generally an idea that is held by guys, generally. That like but I'm curious okay?
I wanted to push a little bit forward and be like, why didn't you write against that, right? Like, was it a situation of art imitates life? Where you're like, I just don't want to write against this. I want to just display it as what is happening. So I'm interested in that.
So I didn't want it to come off as preachy. I didn't want, it annoys me so much, when I'm online and I see some guy who says, women must go to work, stuff like that. Women deserve jobs. Like, that's like obvious things. Like, I feel like it's not something that you should like wave a banner, or like we all agree on these things. So I didn't want to come off as that person. I didn't want to come off as being like preachy, as being like, oh, let's respect women, whatever. I wanted it to be raw. I wanted it to be like raw, exactly how I wanted him to be, like clearly a bad person. I wanted I wanted him to come off as clearly a very, very bad person.
I found it interesting that I found some of the relationships in the book really, really interesting, right? So, I mean, I'm thinking of the scene where he's with his friends, right? And then there's an altar, because I think that you were making a commentary about just like some of these middle class indulgences that are particularly interesting, right? So where there's an altar to a famous comedian, and there's this like touch of religiosity, so there's like prayer and spirituality, and I found that very interesting, that like in the midst of all of these things, right, there is still this ode to like spirituality and to this religiosity. And I find it particularly interesting because a number of people who have mental health problems often turn to extreme religion or extreme like spirituality in order to cope, right? And I found that particular scene interesting, and so I wanted to know if there was a particular commentary that you were making in the midst of all the stuff that's going on in this book. These people take time out to pray ahead of what promises to be just like the most debaucherous, wild night ever.
Okay, so I wanted to juxtapose the two. So I wanted to juxtapose the two ideas, right? So if you notice, like, the character is not very religious. He's very very anti-religion, right? And then his friends aren't particularly religious, but they have this sort of like affinity towards like religiosity, like you mentioned. And now, so again, the thing you said earlier about Ari, right? There's a line in the Devil's Advocate where Al Pacino says to Keanu Reeves that God likes to watch. So he says like essentially exist as like God's amusement. So, and then Ari also, like, he carries that also, like, essentially people just exist for his amusement. So as far as the religious part of it, the commentary I was trying to make there, it's twofold, man. Like, essentially people don't really take it that seriously. I feel like essentially people don't really take it that seriously, and the people who do and they're not really paying attention. I think I said that earlier in the book, that people who are like super religious have like, there's something wrong.
What I thought was really interesting was this addition of this German tourist, right? I thought it was interesting, and I want you to speak a little bit about that. Like, I just felt it was like this like random German tourist who who just like was touristy. But I wanted to speak a little bit about like that, like what was the utility in the story? Because like who also, like, how do you just give someone a rental car and money just in J, like you just like take, like, go. I don't know you. You're not my friend. We're not close. Just take. Like, I can't fathom that.
Really, Letokonola, I mean, if you are somebody who is privileged and who's used to moving in the world in a particular way, you never believe that like danger or bad things may happen to you, right? Because the cards have always fallen on the right side for you. So that behavior for me was actually not uncharacteristic. If there was anybody in the book who was going to move in that way, it would definitely be those German tourists who are there in many ways to like, you know what I mean? Like those township tours where you watch like, it's like poverty
So I
porn,
said,
you know, like I
yeah,
watch people living.
So I said in the book, right, it seems like they want to prove to themselves that they are woke. I said, now these white people seem like they want to prove to themselves that they're woke. So that's why they're being like very accommodating to me. They're being like, oh, we're not like the other whites. We'll give you money, we'll give you whatever. We trust you. We're not like the rest of them. So
Like,
that is,
for me, like, I know I got that right, but still, I was like, nah, man, like, seriously, like, this is the extent of which you want to prove that you're not a problematic white person. Like, you're trying to purge yourself off of this by doing this. Hey, wait, see, whiteness is a tough job, man.
I don't know specifically. I was just making a point. Maybe I don't know. Maybe this doesn't exist. But I was just making a point that because if you've been to Opikopi, you see that like Opikopi is like this place, right, where like you can basically do anything with anyone. People don't really care. Like you can come and eat with us. It's a very friendly environment. So I sort of like took that thing that happens, like I sort of like took that and then wanted to put that in like a township situation. And then what would happen if the same thing would happen? Go Kasi somewhere. If you're just so accommodating, you can just do whatever with anyone.
But also to speak to the ways in which whiteness also knows how to weaponize existing power structures, right? So they didn't hesitate to call the police. They didn't hesitate to weaponize the information that he'd given them because they knew where he would be. He'd given them that information. So there are things about also knowing that the structures of power will always move in ways that favor you. So for me, I found it particularly interesting that they were super, super trustworthy, panicked, ran to the police, and then also were able to weaponize those kind of existing structures, right? To look for him in that crowded place, right? To know that the way you look also means that you can navigate certain situations in a particular way is always really interesting because there are people who know that they will always be able to weaponize existing structures to fulfill certain things for themselves. I mean, yes, he took their car. There's also a thing about like, how do you give your car to a stranger? What is that? Also, you're giving your car to a stranger to do something illegal for you as well, right? So you're happy for him to incur the risk, but you're stressed about incurring the risk of him then taking your car. There's just things there. And I thought there was an interesting commentary about like, this benevolent whiteness that often gets modeled as like being a good white who's not like them, who doesn't move in the same ways, who's actually a good person, who isn't like the others.
You said a lot. I wanted to make a point I forgot now, but so I'll talk first about the benevolent whiteness thing. That is again also that was also intentional. That like, oh no, it's like a sneaky, like I've got like a knife behind my back, but I'm hugging you sort of thing. Like the whole time, like I'm watching and what's going on. Oh yeah, so yeah, in the police, as Black people in South Africa, we know that we don't have the best relationship with the police. And we, it very rarely happens where the police, with anything that involves the police, ends up in your favor. I think I said in the book where like nobody takes police seriously in this country because nobody really believes in them. It's an institution.
I mean, I thought it was also interesting because I think, benevolent whiteness is also whiteness as innocence, right? Like the idea that just because I'm white and I'm woke, I'm innocent. But we knew exactly what was going on. Like you are not innocent and you're not making this other person do an innocent thing. But le ene man, protagonist wa rona, like going to a strip, there's just a lot that was happening, there's just like a lot that was happening, right? And also the sort of misogyny also played itself out with the sexual encounter that happened at the strip club, right? Where the woman was like, wait again, like you need to finish so that I can go. And he felt offended because, how dare a woman take ownership of her body and her autonomy and not listen to my every whines and my every need, right? So that was quite interesting for me to think about, like even in like the misogyny like this person was exhibiting was like, I wanted to get into the book and have a conversation with them and be like, okay, Mara, like calm down a little bit, just a little bit.
But I also think you have your sympathy stretched, right? So at which point do you begin not to excuse particular behaviors because of mental illness, right? So does your depression then mean that you can exhibit misogyny because you're not well? Or what does that look like? And that for me was what I was interested in. What does accountability look like in the context of this particular character who has the issues with mental health that he does, who has the substance use issues that he does? What does accountability then look like, right? In the face of sympathy as well. How does it look to be sympathetic, but also hold somebody accountable for their behavior?
Okay, so the misogyny, right? So misogyny is something that we are all unlearning as guys, really, because it's something that's it's massaged into you when you're a kid. Then you grow out of it over time. So essentially, the protagonist hasn't really grown out of that. He's still very much Ntwana Kokas. He still just sees women as objects and whatnot. And as far as accountability, I didn't really see him as like he doesn't have a redeemable guy. I didn't really see him as someone who's like redeemable in his behavior. That's why he doesn't really come off as being accountable or particularly sympathetic. To especially again to like the prostitute girl. He's like, what the fuck is this? What's going on here? I thought I paid money for this. What's going on? So I wanted that also to show. Like I wanted him to clearly be a bad person. To like clearly be like, this guy's a bad guy.
I mean, I think it's also important for us to have a note about language, right? As I suppose both Alma and I were really jarred by the word prostitute on the pages, right? Because we know that there's a moralistic inclination of using the word prostitute. There's some sort of moral indignation that exists, right? Because we're saying that this person is not doing a legitimate work. We're saying that this person is not doing a work that's already been recognized, and it's just morally reprehensible. And we prefer the word sex work because effectively what that person is doing is offering a service, right? And getting paid for that service in the same way that I show up at work every day and I do whatever I need to do, right? And so I was just thinking a note about language. I was like, maybe it was intentional that you use the word prostitute because the protagonist is an unredeemable person. But it's also important to note that like words like that continue the stigma of sex work, right? And if we're in the process of decriminalizing sex work, it's important for us to name the work as work and not further stigmatize it.
Yeah, I was going to contest that when you brought that up initially. I was going to contest that, but now that now I get what you mean. Okay, yeah, I agree with you actually. Yes. Because I was going to say, but I agree with you. You're totally correct. Yeah. Totally correct. I was going to contest you initially. I'm like, but yeah, I understand what you mean, and I agree. Actually, that's actually a good point.
I saw Alma being ready to like jump, right? So I was like, okay, hold up. Let's be cordial. Let's see what's going to happen.
Only because I think that the language that we have as a community around sex work, and sexuality also informs a lot of the problematic ways in which we engage with it, right? So a lot of the respectability politics is also informed by the language that we use around sex and sexuality, right? So it also informs the sort of attitudes that people have. So that's the only reason I was like, but it's cool. We all good. What I do want to talk about though is running, right? In this book, there is a lot of running, right? He does a lot of running, and I'm interested in that, in running as a metaphor, right? The character runs a lot, runs away from things, runs towards things, but also runs as an escape, right? Escape as a desire. So escape as a desire, like the escape of death, the escape of life, right? So this person wants to escape life, but also wants to escape the kind of life that they're living, their living circumstances. And for me, running as a metaphor was particularly important in the story. So I wanted us to speak a little to that, right? So this idea of just living a life of constantly running away from yourself, from things.
Yeah. So I mentioned this in the book. I mentioned this in the book a couple times. The 27 Club, the idea that I want to die at this age, right? So even then, like sort of like just like racing to his own death. He's racing to his own demise. He just wants everything. He wants everything to happen as quickly as possible because he wants it to stop. So running in this book is just about. It's like he's running. The destination really is just his own end. So he's just accelerating his own end. He just wants to accelerate his own demise. That's what that's about.
I mean, I also was interested in this little tidbit, right? So very early on in the book, there is, I'll read, it's like from page 11. It says, the word bisexual is only reserved for women. Guys can't be bisexual. You can fuck a dude once, you're gay, man, I say. Dude, 100% correct. And I was interested in that because I was like, okay, so this is at the beginning of the book. Maybe there might be some sort of something that's happening in the book that like, something. And then, yeah, it kind of stops there. So I was interested in that inclusion, right? About why we were talking about the idea of bisexuality as being reserved only for women and not for men in this.
Okay, that for me was like okay on Saturday. I went to a thing. It was a Jägermeister night embassy thing, right? It was like a friend of mine was invited to be there. So it was the first time I was in like a very, very queer space, right? Because it was just like a bunch of like trans people, a bunch of like gay people, lesbians. It was a great time. It was amazing, right? But then that also it also pointed that point. It reminded me of that point in the book because I feel like sexuality really for like a guy, the stakes are much higher for a guy as far as like if you're going to be the stakes are much higher for like what gay men than for like gay women, right? Because gay men are significant are policed much harder than I believe gay men are there's policing that happens that's more severe towards gay men than it is towards women. And then later in the book I make another point where he says which men would I invite into my anus. There's like a line like that, yeah, sort of like show that like a latent bisexuality thing going on here that he doesn't want to like reconcile because he knows that like there's like a intense there's like the focus is much harder on like guys, I believe.
But I think also, to be honest, it's the price of masculinity, right? It's like there
Yeah.
is this bastion, like it's like a bastion of being. Like I'm this macho person, and like to be like a macho person, these are the things that one are not going to make me macho, right? So it's because it's interesting. It's like on the one hand, I thought the comment about bisexuality was very interesting because in the queer community, bi men are often ostracized because you can't make a decision, right? But in the straight community, bi men are often ostracized because, oh, you actually are really gay, you just don't want to say. So there's like this like to and fro that happens on either side of the spectrum. Like the people who are the bastions and the holders of masculinity are rejecting you, and the people who are supposed to be the holders of queerness are also rejecting you. So like biness is a contested field. Like, Mpondaba writes a very interesting post in the Maiden Guardian about like just navigating his life as a bi man and how that's really been difficult because you just really don't have a place to belong. And that comment for me was really interesting because even the comment about who will you allow in your anus was sort of like, it has to be the ndodas of ndodas who I will allow in because, I can't allow any femme person or any person because then it decreases my masculinity. So there's this constant negotiation of like masculinity and holding on to masculinity. And that for me was what was interesting because it made me think about like really like, where do bi men fit in? Like, where do bi men get a space to just be where they're not constantly being told what they are and what they are not?
Yeah. So I was gonna ask, like, would you say that you agree then? Like that okay, that idea that like men are policed like much more severely. Would you say that you agree or not?
No, I do. I mean, Patricia Hill Collins and a lot of Black writers have spoken about like the Black men's sexuality as a thing that's been policed, right? I think, though, it is an important thing to say that Black men's sexuality is policed, right? But Black women's sexuality is also policed in ways that can be more disastrous for Black women than it is for Black men, right? So Black men are kind of let's think about butch presenting lesbians, for instance, right? Their masculinity is policed, their sexuality is policed, their womanhood is policed. And the effect of that is that they could be killed as a result of being butch presenting, not wanting to be with men and loving women, right? Whereas, like, Black men's sexualities, particularly Black men who navigate the world in a particular way, right? Black bisexual men who navigate the world in a particular way, it is policed, but often the consequences of that policing is not death in the way that transgender persons are potentially led to death, or femme gay men are led to death, or butch presenting lesbians are led to death. So I think, yes, that is correct, but we need to think about the manifestations of that policing and how it maps onto bodies.
The consequences aren't like as grave potentially. They aren't as potentially grave as if it was okay. I didn't really think about that. It's actually a good point.
I mean, so also to add to that, Letokonolo, right, is to think about other repercussions of policing, like Black women's sexuality, right? So you think about access to healthcare, right? So because there is a policing of sexuality and there is a resulting responsibility that comes to it, when you are a Black woman who enjoys sex and for whatever reason you may need access to reproductive services, you will then be policed in ways that are actually quite serious for you. So access to things like abortion or termination of pregnancy is not something that you will have access to, because even that sexuality is policed. So why are you expressing your sexuality? But also the idea of like the creation of the perfect victim. So if something ever happens to you and you were a woman who expressed their sexuality, there are things created there, right? So you are then not to be seen as the perfect victim. So even the sympathy and the empathy that people have for you is very minimal, because of course there's a policing of the sexuality that you have. So those kinds of consequences are grave. I mean, I think that like for a lot of Black men, masculinity is a prison, right? So it is a self-created prison in many ways. But the ways in which Black women's sexuality is policed, I don't know that we can say is less harsh, right? Or that the it's less harsher than Black men. I think that I'm on the fence about using that kind of language, because you think about the consequences of policing Black women's sexuality, and they are so far ranging. I mean, from death to access to reproductive health facilities, to even just what the criminal justice system will think of, or the extent to which people will want to protect you because of your sexuality is massive.
I think also a point needs to be made about this, right? So in the massive consequences and implication of policing, women's sexuality, queer people's sexuality, trans people's sexuality, Black men's sexuality is policed in this sense, is that Black men are not able to make decisions and navigate world freely for themselves. And that in itself, yeah.
To me, it was just like a matter of like expression. I feel like the expression of it, like I feel like a guy wearing a dress, for example, and it's like a huge deal compared to like a butch presenting female, for instance. I feel like the freedom of expression is like not really the same.
No, I don't think so. I think that over time now there's this what we call queer aesthetics. So there's some men who participate in the queer aesthetic and not the queer lifestyle and the queer struggle, right? And
I didn't know that was a thing.
And get rewarded for it, right? So if you're a straight man wearing a dress, you are rewarded for it.
I didn't even know that was a thing. Wow, I didn't know. Oh yeah, okay, not.
But what I'm saying is we have to not underestimate the emotional mental turmoil that certain Black men have to go through in life, because Sarah Hamed speaks about this concept of like compulsory heterosexuality. Because of compulsory heterosexuality, you find that men are literally like in turmoil because they have to perform this heterosexuality, either in a coupling or in deprivation of themselves. So we have to be very careful in us saying that, oh, it's not that grave. No. It is not. The consequences are not grave in the way that it may not lead to death, right? But the gravity of it is that you are now living your life as a fiction of your imagination, or a little bit of who you are, right? Or you find that you are living 3 multiple lives as a result of that. And that for me is turmoil, right? It's because it's like you're not able to live as your full self. And that is great.
So I think the point that I'm making is not to say that it is less grave, but I think there was a comment made earlier about how, for women it's less harsh, and I don't know that we can make those kinds of extreme comparisons, like it's less harsh, it's more harsh, right? Because who's to say that like not being able to live in the fullness of who you are isn't a grave consequence, in the same way that being a woman who has their sexuality punished, right? Or has their sexuality policed is not grave. I think that we need to also be careful to avoid almost oppression Olympics, right? So like one is more grave than the other. I think that multiple oppressions exist, right? And multiple things can be true at the same time. Like men's masculinities in many ways can also be a prison, but they can also find their self-expression in many ways limited by that. And multiple things can be true at the same time. And I think it's important to also acknowledge that. But I want to talk a little bit about like what the reaction to the book has been, right? I mean, in many ways, I think that you're writing a story that so many of us can relate to. So many of us know a guy that you grew up with who was like so smart and whose future just looked so bright, who had their entire trajectory curtailed, right, by mental health, by substance use, right? And there's almost like a feeling of hopelessness, right, when you think of that kind of story. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the reaction to this book, which is very relatable, have been.
Okay, first of all, now I like what you said about the cost of masculinity, because like even to this day, right, I have friends who refuse to listen to Lil Nas X because he's gay. I'm like, but like it's a banger, but it's kind of makes great music. But my friends still want to listen to him because for some reason there's a cost of implication to them, which I don't understand. And okay, so generally, okay, I had a similar thing before with Bolo Rains Tole via the Bookworms Book Club. They said that they thought the book was sad, right? And I remember like when I wrote the book, I wasn't really writing like a sad story. I wanted it to be funny. I wanted it to be like really like I'd like to think I sort of like hit that kind of. Right, I didn't. It wasn't. I wanted it to be humorous, bro. Like
it's sad.
It wasn't funny. Like it was just like, what the hell is going on, right? But for me, it was like, what the hell is going on? I kind of want to know more. I need to get to what is going to happen, right? I didn't think it was sad, right? I thought it was allowing us to think about the realities that we often don't think about, right? So for me, it was a story that needed to be told in the way that it was told, because I find that like often we think a book like this will go a particular way, but you're in a little roller coaster, right? Like this person is like narcissistic, like, it was a lot. And in truth, when you say funny, I thought Ari was really funny. I thought Ari was humorous, like was doing things in order to be like, look at these silly humans and look at what's important to them. Like, look at them. That's what I thought. I thought that.
So I thought that the book was sad, right? I thought that the book was sad because in many ways it was relatable, you know? So in many ways you can see the trajectory of like somebody whose life may have just turned out completely different if they were not Black, poor and living where they were living, right? So and you think about how for so many people the odds are stacked against them even before they enter the game of life, right? So like what were the chances that things were going to turn out particularly great for him, right? So his friends are the exceptions. His friends who are adverts are in many ways the exceptions. They are the magical Blacks, right? The exceptional Blacks. And for me, it was the relatability of the story made it really sad because so many of us know someone like the character in the book, and so many of us know someone for whom the end is very similar to this. So yes, it's true that you wrote about the realities, but I think that being numb to the realities, or just like almost being laissez-faire about them, is also what stops us from continuously being shocked. Like we should be shocked that we should continuously be heard, right? That this is the story of so many people who look like us that we grew up with, whose brilliance and whose life just completely doesn't turn out well, right? So I found the story sad, not because they weren't like endearing moments in the book, but because ultimately there's something about just like the precarity of Black life, but also just the ways in which so much of what happens to us is really outside of our control, right? Like you don't choose to be born into a particular family. You don't choose to have people who may be emotionally neglectful. You don't choose to be in a community that doesn't know how to handle mental health problems. Also, you don't choose to inherit generational trauma in the way that so many of us have, right? And for me, that was the standout moment, to see how so many bright futures get snuffed out by all of these things that exist outside of them.
Yeah, yeah. It's just the nature of existence, man. I just think life is hard, bro. That's the major point, that life is hard. Life is hard for everyone. And generally,
it's hard for everyone, but it's harder for some people. And
just
and like the
Operation Olympics just now.
No.
We're just saying Operation Olympics just now.
But it's not Operation Olympics. Saying that like
you don't think so?
It's not Operation Olympics.
I think
it's actually
life is hard for everyone, but it's not hard in the same ways.
Of understanding that race, class, gender, sexuality means that your life expectancy, your life trajectory will be different from mine, right? That's not to say I'm more oppressed, but I'm saying that I'm going to navigate the world a little differently from you because of the opportunities that they may be granted to, right? And I think that really is what the book is trying to look at Alma's face. That's really what the book is trying to come at, to say that, like, there's some people who life is really hard for, and also there's some people who systems are making life for them. No matter how hard they are going to try, there are systems that are going to continuously exclude them. And it's a conversation we need to have, is that, you know, sometimes it's not a pull yourself up by the bootstraps type of thing. It's like literally the world is anti-Black, the world is anti-woman, the world is anti-queer. And in those confines, it's hard for you to live. And that realization is not to say we can't create magic for ourselves, we can't be humorous, but it's to say that, like, for some of us, actually, from the day we were born, life was against us.
Life is harder. I mean, also, just to add to that, before you respond, to also speak to the idea that, like, that yes, life is hard, but life is not hard in the exact same way for everybody, and life is harder for some people, right? And, like, the lack of acknowledgement of that is also what allows certain systems to continue to exist, right? Because there's the idea that there are Black people who succeed, who come from the same background as you. And so instead of thinking of those people as the anomaly, those people get treated as, like, the barometer at which everybody should be held, because we don't want to have a collective acknowledgement that some people just do have it harder than other people, right? That the odds that other people are going to have to beat to succeed are very different to somebody who's a third generation university graduates, who has access to mental health resources, whose family also has an understanding of mental health that is so far ranging and so broad, but also has the resources in where they're not equipped to actually ensure that this person succeeds. Like, some people are equipped for success and other people have to fight against the odds in order to reach it. And nobody talks about the toll of fighting to reach success.
Yeah, like, I mean, of course, we all have, there are certain inhibitors that inhibit anyone from really practicing their agency, right? Because you might want to do whatever you want to do, but at certain points, there are certain obstacles that are in your way, and some of them may never be overcome because you are a certain person, because you come from a certain place, because you are raised in a certain home. That's true. That's totally true, 100% true. But that similarly, still, there is a toll on you. But at the same time, there's a level of, like, accountability also that you should accept, essentially, that your life is hard.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tshidiso, for this conversation. I thought it veered into places that I wouldn't imagined it would have gone to, but it really speaks to testament to the power of stories and the power of this story. And we hope really that more and more people will begin to have conversations in more nuanced way, and that this will be a catalyst that people use to have those conversations. We hope that the book will continue to sell, and that perhaps you will come up with another trailblazer in another genre, and that you will continue to write. But really, thank you for extending yourself in the way that you have done in this conversation. From the Cheeky Natives, once again, we want to say thank you, but also we want to remind you that you can also get the book from Loot. And if you buy it now until the 5th of November, you'll get a 30% discount. You don't say the Cheeky Natives does not plug you. We are plugging you right now, and we're saying get it. We'll share the link on our social media for you to effectively get the book and tell your friends, and they will tell their friends. But yeah, thank you so much for what has been a really...
I think before we go, can we just read a few of the comments? I think we've had some interesting comments before we go. I think we're in some esteemed company today.
So I see one says, man, I remember Tshidiso from Wits. We did the same course, literally one of the smartest guys we had in class.
She's lying. Oh, she's lying. Smartest in the class.
Congratulations on your book. And then we also have someone, Tandeka, on Facebook also says, I can't wait to get the book. Tandeka, 30% discount right now.
Which you have to do, boo.
And Aisha, who is an author, which we have to make it happen.
Aisha, after this.
Yeah. Says, yep, also thought the German was pretty arb.
What does arb mean?
Arbitrary.
Oh, arbitrary or random. Oh.
Okay.
And then love the comment about destigmatizing sex with Kluchi. So those are really some of the comments that we had. But I mean, this one was also really important, really thoughtful comments on mental health. Thank you. Yeah. So-called nerds and eccentrics are just written off as being crazy or even faking it when they have serious mental health issues. I mean, thinking about that, we think about Silo, Kabelo Silo Deka, and like how people are like, oh, you know, he was just a genius, and you know, but really not contending with what like mental health does to a person. But again, Tshidiso Moletsane, thank you so much for coming on to the Cheeky Natives. We hope that this conversation has been enjoyable. And again, 30% off discount on loot.
You know what to do.
It's today.
Thank you.
Tag us, you know, do whatever. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thursday at 6 p.m.
I had so much fun, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Thank you.
Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.